The problem with history is not that it lies. The problem is that it tells one version with enough confidence that no one thinks to ask for a second. In 1900, sponge divers working off the coast of Antikythera pulled something from the seafloor that had no business being there. A corroded bronze mechanism, roughly the size of a shoebox, packed with gear trains and differential gearing of a precision that Western civilization would not officially rediscover for another 14 centuries. The device calculated astronomical positions. It tracked the metonic cycle. It predicted eclipses. And it had been sitting on the bottom of the Aegean since approximately 60 BCE, inside a Roman cargo ship, alongside statuary and glassware, as if it were ordinary freight. When researchers first X-rayed it in the 1970s, they found at least 30 gears. Later, imaging put the number higher. The mechanism was not primitive, it was not decorative, it was functional, and it implied a chain of workshops, of knowledge, of accumulated engineering tradition, none of which left any other surviving trace. That is not a mystery in the romantic sense. That is a gap. A hard, measurable, documented gap between what the evidence shows and what the established timeline says should have been possible. And Antikythera is not alone. In Pumapunku, stone blocks weighing up to 800 tons show drill marks and interlocking tolerances that baffled engineers who examined them in the 20th century. Not because they are supernatural, but because the tools implied by the cuts do not match the tools the archaeological record assigns to that culture and that period. In Göbekli Tepe, a site deliberately buried by its own builders around 8000 BCE, the carved pillars predate agriculture. Not by a decade, by thousands of years. The people who raised those 12-ton limestone columns were not supposed to have the social organization required to do it. They were not supposed to be there at all. The question is not whether ancient people were smarter than we assume. They clearly were. The question is structural. How many times has the timeline been assembled around the absence of evidence rather than the presence of it? And how many times has that absence simply meant the evidence has not been found yet? 10 discoveries. Different continents, different centuries, different disciplines. Some were dismissed for decades before being reassessed. Some are still contested. Some have been quietly incorporated into revised textbooks with no announcement and no correction. Each one is a crack. And cracks, when you look at them long enough, stop looking like accidents. For most of recorded history, the timeline was not a theory. It was infrastructure. By the 19th century, archaeology had become a discipline with ambitions of precision. Stratigraphy, the reading of soil layers, gave researchers a vertical calendar. The deeper the object, the older the object. Carbon dating, introduced after World War II, added numbers. Institutions like the British Museum, the Smithsonian, the Louvre were not merely storage facilities. They were epistemological authorities. What they dated stayed dated. What they classified stayed classified. The system worked through consensus. A finding would be excavated, documented, sent to peer review, and absorbed into the accepted sequence. The sequence was cumulative. Each new discovery was expected to confirm and extend the existing framework, not rupture it. Ruptures were inconvenient. They required revising textbooks, rewriting grant applications, and, most costly of all, admitting that previous conclusions had been premature. The dominant model, stable through most of the 20th century, placed complex, organized civilization, monumental architecture, writing, coordinated labor, long-distance trade, at no earlier than roughly 5,000 years ago. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. These were the anchors. Everything else was measured against them. This was not dogma. It was a working model built from the best available evidence. The problem with working models is that they create expectations, and expectations over time become filters. A site excavated with the assumption that nothing significant predates 4000 BCE will be sampled accordingly. Layers beneath that threshold may be noted and set aside, not suppressed, simply deprioritized. Funding follows hypothesis. Hypothesis follows consensus. The loop is not conspiratorial. It is institutional. Meanwhile, the physical world kept producing objects that did not fit. A map drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis showed the coastline of Antarctica, a continent not officially discovered until 1820, and not accurately charted below its ice sheet until the seismic surveys of the 1950s. The map's provenance was documented. Piri Reis himself noted in a marginal annotation that he compiled it from older source charts, some of which he attributed to the time of Alexander the Great. Those source charts have never been found. In 1936, workers at the Baghdad Museum catalogued a ceramic vessel, approximately 13 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic solution, grape juice or vinegar, it generates roughly 1.1 volts of electrical current. It predates Alessandro Volta's documented battery by more than 1,000 years. Neither object destroyed the timeline. Both were absorbed into footnotes. The system was functioning exactly as designed, which is precisely why the cracks when they came were so difficult to see. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which translates without drama as Potbelly Hill. The site had been noted by American researchers in the 1960s and dismissed. The survey report described it as a medieval cemetery. The stone fragments visible at the surface were logged and the site was closed. Schmidt looked at the same fragments and saw something different. He began excavating. What came out of the ground did not match the cemetery classification or any other classification that fit the accepted sequence. The pillars were T-shaped, up to 6 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons each. They were arranged in circles. They were carved, with foxes, vultures, scorpions, abstract symbols cut with a precision that implied not improvisation but a established iconographic tradition. And they had been deliberately, methodically buried, not by collapse, not by erosion, by the people who built them. The carbon dating came back at approximately 9,000 to 11,500 years before the Common Era. That is not a rounding error. Agriculture, the foundational technology of organized civilization in the Standard Model, does not appear in the archaeological record until roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era, and in most regions, several thousand years later. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not supposed to have the surplus labor, the hierarchical coordination, or the sustained collective intention required to quarry, transport, and erect those pillars. Hunter-gatherer bands, the consensus held, did not build temples. They survived. Schmidt's conclusion was careful and specific. The site predates pottery, predates writing, predates the domestication of wheat, and yet it demonstrates organized, large-scale, symbolically sophisticated construction activity sustained across what appears to be multiple generations. The institution did not suppress this. It published it. And that created a different kind of problem, because if Göbekli Tepe existed, then the sequence was wrong. Not at the edges, but at the foundation. The Standard Model did not have a category for a monument-building culture that preceded agriculture. It had a direction. Complexity grew over time, from simple to elaborate, from nomadic to settled. Göbekli Tepe ran that arrow backwards. Researchers began re-examining other sites with new questions. Underwater surveys off the coast of India near Dwarka found structured stone formations at depths, suggesting submersion during the post-glacial sea level rise, which ended approximately 6,000 years ago but began in force around 12,000 years ago. Off the coast of Japan near Yonaguni, a formation of stepped stone platforms with flat surfaces and right-angle cuts had been photographed since the 1980s. Debate about whether it was natural or constructed had stalled for years. After Göbekli Tepe, the debate restarted. No one announced a crisis. The journals kept publishing. The museums kept their labels. But in certain archaeology departments, in certain late conversations after certain conferences, a quieter question had begun to circulate. Not what else did we miss, but how systematically did we miss it? The problem with one anomaly is that it can be contained. The problem with several is that they start talking to each other. By the early 2000s, the conversation had moved out of specialist journals and into a more uncomfortable space, interdisciplinary. Geologists were being asked to look at archaeology. Astronomers were being asked to look at ancient architecture. Oceanographers were being asked to look at submerged coastlines. Each discipline had its own tolerance for uncertainty, its own publication standards, its own definition of proof. When they converged on the same questions, the friction was institutional as much as intellectual. In Egypt, the debate over the Sphinx had been running since 1991, when geologist Robert Schoch presented an analysis of the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls at the Geological Society of America. His argument was technical and narrow. The erosion pattern on the vertical rock faces was consistent with prolonged rainfall weathering, not wind and sand. The Sphinx enclosure showed this signature deeply. The last period of sustained rainfall heavy enough to produce that kind of erosion in the Giza region ended approximately 7,000 years ago, roughly 3,000 years before the date the Sphinx is officially assigned. The Egyptological establishment rejected this not primarily on geological grounds but on archaeological ones. There was no other material evidence of a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx at that earlier date. The argument was circular in a way that satisfied neither side. Schoch's geology implied a civilization. The absence of that civilization's other traces was used to disprove the geology. Meanwhile, the Antikythera mechanism was being re-examined with technology that had not existed when it was first recovered. In 2006, an international research team used high-resolution three-dimensional X-ray tomography and surface imaging to map the internal structure of the surviving fragments in detail. What they found extended the known gear count and revealed inscriptions, a user manual effectively written directly onto the mechanism's internal plates. The text described planetary motions, eclipse cycles, and Panhellenic Games calendars. The device did not merely calculate, it was designed to be used regularly by someone who needed accurate astronomical data for practical purposes. The manufacturing tolerances of the gears were measured at under 0.5 millimeter deviation. Consistent, repeatable, implying not a single genius working in isolation but a production context. A tradition of precision metalworking that left no other surviving artifacts. Historians of technology began asking what else from that tradition had simply not survived. Bronze is recyclable. Instruments get melted down. Libraries burn. The absence of corroborating artifacts might not mean the technology was unique. It might mean it was common enough to be reused rather than preserved. In South America, LiDAR surveys, aerial laser mapping technology that strips away jungle canopy to reveal ground topology, began returning results over the Amazon basin that rewrote the demographic assumptions of pre-Columbian civilization. Geoglyphs, causeways, managed earthworks covering areas of hundreds of square kilometers, invisible from the ground, invisible to previous aerial photography, built by populations the existing record had described as sparse and nomadic. The surveys covered only a fraction of the total basin. Each discovery was reported individually, in its own disciplinary context, with its own careful qualifications. No single institution was responsible for connecting them. No formal body existed to ask what they implied collectively. The timeline was not breaking. It was developing pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and the structure holding it together was not evidence. It was habit. There is a point in every structural argument where the accumulation of exceptions stops being a list and becomes a pattern. That point had been reached. The question was whether the pattern meant what it appeared to mean. In 2013, researchers working at a site called Cerruti Mastodon in San Diego County, California, recovered mastodon bones alongside stones that showed impact patterns consistent with deliberate fracturing, the kind produced when a heavy cobble is used to break bone for marrow extraction. The bones and the stones were found in direct physical association at the same sediment level, with no geological evidence of mixing or displacement. The dating came back at 130,000 years before the present. The official position on human presence in the Americas had been stable for decades. The first migration across the Bering Land Bridge occurred no earlier than 15,000 years before the present, possibly as recently as 13,000. The Taruti site implied a human or human-adjacent presence 115,000 years before that. The paper was published in Nature in 2017, one of the most rigorously reviewed scientific journals in the world. The peer reviewers did not find a methodological error sufficient to reject it. They published it with a note of extreme caution and an implicit invitation for the broader community to disprove it. The broader community spent the following years attempting exactly that. No definitive refutation has been published as of the time this was written. The site remains classified as deeply contested, which in institutional language means we cannot explain it, and we are not yet prepared to accept what explaining it would require. What it would require is this: either a species capable of processing mastodon bones was present in North America 130,000 years ago, which has no corroboration in the genetic or fossil record for anatomically modern humans at that location and date, or the behavioral complexity associated with tool use and systematic food processing appeared independently in a lineage we have not yet identified and then vanished without further trace. Neither option is comfortable. Both are currently on the table. The discomfort deepens when placed alongside the genetics. In 2019 and 2020, ancient DNA studies of skeletal remains from Lagoa Santa in Brazil, one of the oldest confirmed human sites in South America, dated to approximately 10,000 years before the present, revealed a genomic signature partially distinct from the Siberian populations assumed to be the sole ancestors of all Native Americans. The signal suggested admixture with a population more closely related to Australasians, peoples from the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The migration route implied is not a land bridge, it is oceanic, or at minimum coastal in a way that the accepted model had not accommodated. The researchers were careful. The signal was real but partial. It did not overturn the primary migration model. It complicated it. Specifically, it required that at some point a second population arriving by a different route integrated with the first and then disappeared as a distinct genetic group. When? How? From where exactly? These remain open. And then there is Puma Punku, located in western Bolivia at an altitude of roughly 3,800 meters above sea level. The site contains stone blocks of andesite and red sandstone, the largest of which weigh an estimated 131 metric tons. The blocks are not remarkable for their weight alone. They are remarkable for their cuts. The surfaces show evidence of straight-line grooves, some less than 6 millimeters wide, running with consistent depth across the full length of the block. The corners show right-angle precision measurable in fractions of a millimeter. Several blocks contain interlocking H-shaped channels that fit together without mortar, with tolerances that would challenge modern stone-cutting equipment. The mainstream archaeological position assigns Puma Punku to the Tiwanaku culture, with construction beginning around 500 to 600 of the Common Era. The tools available to that culture, as documented by the archaeological record, were stone, bone, and bronze. No iron, no steel, no abrasive machinery. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated that stone-on-stone cutting can produce straight grooves. They have not demonstrated, under controlled, published, peer-reviewed conditions, that it can produce the specific combination of groove depth, edge consistency, and right-angle precision visible in the Puma Punku blocks at the scale and volume the site represents. The demonstration remains pending. This is not evidence of a lost civilization. It is not evidence of ancient technology from outside the historical record. It is something more specific and more difficult. It is evidence that the current explanation is incomplete, and that the gap between what the tools can do and what the stones show has not been closed by experiment, only by assertion. The assertion runs like this: we know approximately when it was built. We know approximately who built it. Therefore, the tools they had were sufficient to produce what we see. The logic moves from conclusion to evidence rather than from evidence to conclusion. That inversion, quiet, unremarked, embedded in institutional consensus, is not unique to Puma Punku. It appears wherever the physical record and the accepted sequence create friction. The sequence is not adjusted to fit the evidence. The evidence is adjusted to fit the sequence. and the adjustment works. Until the evidence stops cooperating, history does not end. It sediments. What these 10 discoveries left behind is not a unified alternative theory. There is no clean counter-narrative waiting to replace the standard model. What remains is more specific and in some ways more durable. A series of documented, peer-reviewed, institutionally published findings that the existing framework has not fully absorbed, not because they were suppressed, but because absorption would require the framework to admit that its foundational assumption was not a conclusion. It was a convenience. The Antikythera mechanism sits in room 38 of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Fragment A, the largest surviving piece, is displayed behind glass in a climate-controlled case. The inscription on its surface, the one that functions as a user manual, has been partially translated. It refers to a cosmos model. It uses the word sphere. The full text has not been recovered. Approximately 2/3 of the original mechanism is missing, still on the seafloor near the island of Antikythera, or dissolved or unrecognized in some museum storage drawer catalogued as corroded bronze debris. A second expedition using modern underwater robotics recovered additional fragments in 2017. Analysis is ongoing. The mechanism did not come from nowhere. It came from a tradition. That tradition's other products have not been found. This is the fact that the display case does not explain. Klaus Schmidt continued excavating Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014. He estimated that roughly 5% of the site had been uncovered by that point. The site covers an area of approximately 90,000 square meters. Current excavation teams working under Turkish government authorization have expanded the dig. New enclosures keep appearing. In 2017, ground-penetrating radar surveys identified at least 16 additional ring structures beneath the surface, unexcavated. The full extent of the site is not known. Schmidt's published conclusion, repeated in multiple interviews in the final years of his life, was careful but direct. Göbekli Tepe does not fit, not at the margins, at the center. The site requires a rethinking of the relationship between symbolic capacity, social organization, and subsistence strategy, the 3 pillars on which the standard developmental model of human civilization rests. He did not speculate about what that rethinking should produce. He documented the problem and left the solution open. The Taruti Mastodon site in California has not been re-excavated since the original study. The location is protected. Access requires permitting. The cobbles and bone fragments identified in the 2017 Nature paper are stored and catalogued. No subsequent team has produced a geological or taphonomic explanation sufficient to account for the impact patterns without human or human-adjacent agency. The site remains in a formal state of unresolved contestation, which means in practical terms that it exists in the literature, it cannot be dismissed, and it cannot yet be integrated. 130,000 years is not an abstraction. It is the distance between what the record confirms and what the physical evidence at that site implies. That distance has a shape, it has a sediment layer, it has a catalog number. The Amazon LiDAR surveys have now covered an area estimated at roughly 1% of the total basin. The structures already identified, geoglyphs, raised field systems, causeways, settlement mounds, imply a pre-Columbian population density that some researchers place between 8 million and 50 million people across the region at peak occupation. The range itself is an admission. The data is too incomplete to narrow it further. 99% of the basin has not been surveyed at resolution sufficient to detect what 1% has already shown. What collapsed that population was not obscurity. It was disease. European contact in the 16th century introduced pathogens to which Amazonian populations had no acquired immunity. Mortality estimates for the first century of contact run between 50 and 90% across different regions and different epidemic waves. The civilization that built the geoglyphs did not fade gradually. It was removed rapidly before any European observer thought to document what they were destroying. The jungle reclaimed the infrastructure within generations. By the time systematic exploration began, the forest looked primary. It was not. This is the detail that changes the texture of the entire question. The absence of evidence for complex pre-Columbian Amazon civilization was not the result of the civilization not existing. It was the result of the civilization being destroyed faster than it could be recorded, and then being searched for by people who arrived after the jungle had already won. That mechanism, catastrophic erasure followed by assumption of absence, is not unique to the Amazon. It applies wherever the conditions for preservation were poor, wherever conflict or climate or simple time destroyed the physical record before the intellectual framework existed to look for it. The standard model was built from what survived. What survived was not a representative sample. It was a residue. None of this proves a lost advanced civilization. None of this proves ancient contact between continents that the record does not document. The evidence does not support those conclusions, and stating them would require ignoring the same standards of rigor that make the anomalies significant in the first place. What the evidence does support is narrower and harder to dismiss. The timeline was constructed under conditions of incomplete information, using methods that have since been refined, inside institutions that had structural incentives to maintain stability over revision. Several of its foundational assumptions have since been contradicted by physical evidence that has passed peer review. The contradictions have not been resolved. They have been noted, contested, partially absorbed, and left open. Open is where they remain. The Sphinx stands on the Giza Plateau facing east, as it has for however long it has stood there. The weathering on its enclosure walls does not change based on what is written in the textbooks. The grooves in the Pumapunku stone do not widen or close depending on which tool theory is currently favored. The gears in Fragment A of the Antikythera mechanism do not stop being gears because the civilization that produced them left nothing else behind. The physical record is not waiting for consensus, it is waiting for better questions. And the gap between what is officially known and what the evidence actually shows is not closing. In some places, as the instruments improve and the surveys expand, it is getting wider.